Welcome, Douglas Stuart. I've been looking forward to talking to you about your writing. And we will especially focus on your debut novel, Shuggie Bain. You grew up in Glasgow, Scotland, and then worked for many years as a fashion designer in New York. When and why did you start writing Shuggie Bain?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. It's lovely to be here and to meet you finally. Yeah, you know, I grew up as a working class boy in Glasgow, and at the time of my growing up, unemployment in the city was about 28%. I come from a long line of working men, and I grew up in a house without books, which wasn't that unusual for the time or the place, and we loved stories, but we just didn't have any books at home. And I think books were also a little bit of a gendered thing. But I came to writing, I came to reading at about 16, and I realized as soon as I became a reader that I wanted to become a writer. But I was told by the teachers at my school that this wasn't a life that might work out for me. They didn't believe that I would be able to be successful. And so instead I studied textiles, and textiles eventually becomes fashion, and that's what takes me to New York. I've lived in New York now for 25 years. But as I worked in fashion and as I worked for these large American brands, I realized that really all I wanted to do was to read and write. And so I took all my spare time, and as I was working, was writing on a Sunday and in the mornings and the evenings. And I began what really became Shuggie Bain. It took me 10 years to write because I was very busy with my day job, but my writing was always a very safe harbor. It was always an oasis for me, and something that I was very protective of. And so in a way, starting at age 32, I was coming around to my dreams finally.
Also, you have said that you wrote to tell people around you where you came from.
That's right, yeah. I mean, part of the reason why I became a reader at 16 was because I never knew my father, but my father died when I was very young. My mother had suffered with addiction my whole life, from my earliest memories up until she died when I was 16. And so at 16, I lost our family home, I lost my mother, I was orphaned. I had to figure out who I was going to be. But I suddenly also had time in my life to read and to have the peace to read. But from the poverty that I grew up in Glasgow, then to the life working in luxury fashion in New York, there was nobody in my life that understood both halves of me. The people who knew me from Glasgow knew a one side of me, and they obviously couldn't follow me to New York. And then all the people that I worked with and made friends with in New York didn't understand, couldn't find Scotland on a map. And so in a way I felt like this man who had two very distinct halves, and nobody quite knew the entirety of me. Even perhaps myself, even perhaps I didn't know who I was also. And so I sat down at 32, I think, with this great distance from New York to Glasgow, and began to write really what it had felt like to me to grow up in Glasgow in the 1980s, when you were suffering with many things that you had to keep very secret. I'm very proud to be working class, but I was taught to be ashamed to be poor, that we didn't have anything at home. I was taught to be ashamed to be gay, and I was also taught to be ashamed to say that we had addiction at home, that my mother was an alcoholic. And so these things, there was so much silence in my life, both as a child around that, but then as an adult, because New Yorkers just didn't know how to ask me about it. And so I sat down to write, to uncover myself for myself.
But it was not easy for you to have it published.
No, in fact, for many years I thought that I didn't need it to be published because I was working in fashion, and for me being a writer was writing. It wasn't necessarily the professional side of the job, talking to lovely interviewers and meeting readers. It was just, I had to write. But certainly when I decided, part of the reason that I wanted to publish the book ultimately is I realized that if I didn't let it go, I couldn't move on creatively. I couldn't write other novels and stories because I kept going back to Shuggie Bain. And I was very lucky. I applied for an agent, and I was rejected by every agent I went to, but then I find a wonderful agent, and she sends the book out for submission in maybe about 2018. And the book very quickly, she says to me before she sends it out, if you hear back from publishers, do you want me to send you their letters or their emails or other feedback? And I said, yes, please. I was very optimistic, and I said, it will make me a better writer. I would love to hear their feedback. And very quickly we got 20 rejections within a week, I think. And some of them wrote nice things, some of them wrote not so nice things. But I was rejected very quickly and very soundly. And then the night that I was only actually given one publishing offer by one very brave independent publisher in New York called Grove Atlantic. But flash forward a couple of years, and the night that I won the Booker, I was telling a journalist, oh, I was rejected 20 times. And my agent sort of comes in and she says, actually, you were rejected 44 times. I just stopped telling you, you weren't quite as strong as you thought you were. And I think that's true. You know, I think rejection's part of a writer's life, but when you worked on something for 10 years, you can't help but take it personally.
But then, since you have won the Booker Prize for it in 2020, and it has since sold several million copies worldwide. How has that changed your life?
I mean, I think the most material change is that now I'm able to be a writer and to write full time, which, you know, has been a dream, as I said, since I was a young man. And so that's changed everything in my life. I've left fashion behind. I was in my 40s, so maybe that was the right time anyway. But, you know, one of the changes that's a little strange is I quite liked being an outsider. I felt very comfortable in that role because I felt like an outsider my whole life. There was a loneliness there that also helped me to write. And I think once you win something like the Booker, you can't really claim to be an outsider much longer. And so some days I find myself wanting to go back to the periphery and to write from there into the inside. So I'm still sort of figuring out what I'm doing now.
To what extent is the novel based on your own life?
It's a good question, and it's impossible to answer. I would say it's a work of fiction because it's first a novel that deals with a chorus and a community. And I cannot assume any kind of responsibility for those characters. You know, I thought I was going to write about Shuggie Bain, this young boy at the heart of it, and it would be his perspective. But almost as soon as my pen touched the page, all these other characters rushed in because it was a very complicated time in Glasgow. You know, as I said, unemployment went to about 26, 28%, and the Thatcher government closed all heavy industry very much too rapidly, which not only made the men unemployed and their sons unemployed, but it also sort of evaporated any sense of hope or any sense of things getting better. And it stayed that way for about 20 years. But it was a very complicated time. That, of course, when something like that happens, it affects relationships between men and women, it affects relationships in families, it affects future generations. And so from starting from Shuggie, I realized, oh, I have to look at the whole city. I have to capture all of it. So it instantly became a work of fiction. But the truth is although I'm not Shuggie Bain, I grew up in exactly the same circumstances. And so my own life is the basis for it. I was as poor as Shuggie. I am now a gay man, but at the time I wasn't a gay boy. I was just an effeminate, precocious little boy, and the other boys didn't quite know what to notice, that I was different and didn't know what to do with me. And as I explained, you know, my mother suffered with addiction. She gave in to the lack of hope, I think, and she was a very good woman, a very beautiful, very strong woman, but she didn't see much hope for herself in life, and she suffered with addiction my entire life and then died when I was 16. And in a way, I think it's the grief I feel for my mother that made me want to write the book. It made me, as a man in his 30s, I still had no way to deal with that grief or to process it, or even just to share it, to tell people. I think I had friends who would have said my mother was alive, my father was alive, and of course that wasn't true, because I think men have a tough time talking about their personal histories. And so writing for me was a place to sort of explain all of that and to lay it out.
So Agnes in the book is based on your mother.
Yeah, she's a composite of many women. You know, she is based on my mother, but she's based on all the women I knew from the time, little bits. You know, what you have to understand is the working class was really shocked by Thatcherism. When I talk about that unemployment, they would, you know, I grew up in a family, a multi-generational family where I lived with my grandparents. My older siblings worked, my parents worked, my grandparents worked. And then mass unemployment comes to the city and nobody can find enough work. And even if they're working, they are not being paid enough for that work. And so what really happens is people don't quite know what to do. But it also affects people that had an enormous amount of pride and dignity in what they did. You know, they'd given their lives to doing very dangerous, underpaid work. but they felt a huge pride in that. They were very useful, if you know what I mean. You know, I come from miners and shipbuilders and people that worked in distilleries. And so there was such a pride in the working class that I wanted to capture with the character of Agnes and all the women around her and people that almost can't understand what's happening in the city. Because I think that's something that people misunderstand about the modern working class is we have a huge amount of dignity, a huge amount of pride in ourselves, and that's really Agnes's superpower. And I pulled that from many women, and I pulled that from many characters, and I made her almost this impossibly glamorous character as the city's falling down around about her, and that was a joy to write.
She sees herself almost like Elizabeth Taylor sometimes.
Yeah, she's a Glaswegian Elizabeth Taylor, yeah. And I was reflecting a lot on how class is a context and it affects how we view everything, including women. You know, Elizabeth Taylor was this impossible beauty, but in her personal life and on screen, she always played very difficult, willful women. She could be problematic. You know, she was married 7 times. She had her own drink problem. She liked baubles and jewels, and she spoke her mind, and she sort of was outside of the lines or outside of the box. And we celebrated her for that. We kind of loved her. But that's fine when it's a movie star. When it's a working class woman who has this pride in her appearance, who is a single mother, who has many broken love affairs, who has alcoholism, the world is very hard on them because class has changed it. And now you see that woman as a social problem and not someone to be venerated. You know, a lot of what leads to the isolation for the women in the novel, or for the character of Agnes, is not just her addiction, but it's the fact that she's a single mother. And within very tight-knit Catholic communities, they didn't quite know. They thought that was very threatening, first of all. You know, because she is so beautiful when she arrives in the mining town. The other women who really should create a sorority with her and look after her are just instantly threatened by her. And that was a sort of a feeling I stole from Elizabeth Taylor. I thought, what would happen if Elizabeth Taylor was a working class woman? How would people feel?
But she also is a serious alcoholic. And you have many descriptions of how Shuggie and his big brother Leek are always aware of the signs of their mother being drunk. And I would like you to read a passage from the book about Shuggie, who has stomach problems when he comes back from school to his mother.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I think children of alcoholics or addicts learn to be very watchful and very vigilant. If you're a child of someone who suffers with addiction, you learn very early on that you're not the most important person in the room. And so you're always looking for signs, for omens, to try and read the tea leaves to see what kind of day you're going to have. Because, of course, under addiction is a lot of mental health issues. There might be bipolarism, there might be all these other things that affect, that we had no language for at the time. And so as a child, you become incredibly watchful, and you're looking for the smallest detail because it will tell you everything about how that day, that night is going to go. We find Shuggie is coming home from school, and he's watching his mother for the signs. The boy could not remember the change in himself. At what point the cramps died away and things became different was unclear. He could remember coming home from school one Friday in November and standing outside the house as he always did. Every small detail of the house told him of what lay within. This evening the curtains were drawn tight against the cold and the lamps were on. His stomach lifted in hope. Shuggie opened the front door a crack just enough so he could hear the hum of the house. He knew what to listen for. Wailing and crying foretold a bad night. She would want to hold him in her arms and tell him bad stories of the men who had broken her. If there was the sound of country guitars and sad melancholy singing, then the warm moistness of shit would start to wet his underpants. To hear his mother on the telephone was not always a bad sign. He had to creep in between the front door and the draft door to listen very closely to the tone of her voice, push his ear against the cold dimpled glass, and hold his breath. She didn't have to be crying or screaming or slurring her words for the drink to be in her. It could still be there. It sometimes made her overly polite, a false Milgai accent full of long syllabled words. Her lips would pull away from her front teeth, and she would use words like certainly and unfortunately. These were the worst sounds to hear. Agnes was still mourning her losses, but too far from unconsciousness. She would sit him down and tell him her stories, only this time she would be angry and not sad.
Despite Agnes' drinking problem, she has a great desire to look good. She really fights to look good. Where does she get this power from?
I remember the enormous pride of the women that I grew up around, and they instilled it in us as well as children. Like, no matter if there wasn't enough food at home or there was trouble, you were never allowed to go over the front door unless you were absolutely spick and span and looking your best. And I think the sad truth of that is often if you're living in poverty and you're a woman, there's very little you can control. And your appearance and how the face you present to the world is almost the only control you have. And, you know, for Agnes, the character in the novel, it leads to an additional sadness because she presents this immaculate facade. She presents this impossibly glamorous woman, but on the inside, she's disintegrating in a way. And, you know, when women present themselves in a way that almost has ideas above their station or is larger than the audience, let's say, then other women become very sort of defensive about it and become a little hostile towards it. And in a way, Agnes is, she's almost like the last blooming of the most beautiful flower. And it conceals a great sadness, but it also sort of, as well as attracts people, it repels them.
How can Shuggie continue to love his mother so much, even though she gives him so much trouble?
Yeah. Well, first, she's a very lovable character. Because she has enormous strength and she has enormous resourcefulness and she's funny and charismatic. But I think children are remarkable creatures. I think children are born into, you know, less than fortunate circumstances every single day, and yet that is their life. And so they have this almost radical acceptance of what is before them. You know, I think children, unless they know things are going to be different, can really deal with whatever is there. You know, they have an enormous amount of grit if you ask it from them, and they can surprise adults in really strange ways. But you have to remember, Agnes is Shuggie's mother. What is he meant to do but love her? You know, and I think because they have such an intimate relationship, they're almost both two lonely souls who are united by their loneliness. And so he has a front row to everything his mother does. He gets to see all of it. And I think he cannot help but understand that she is hurting, but that also she's almost, you know, I always think of her as the brightest star in his universe, but she's a dying star. She's collapsing in on herself, but he cannot help but be drawn to it, you know, because she's so luminous.
Your mother died when you were only 16 years old. Did losing her so early influence your need to write this book? Oh,
absolutely. I mean, I think people who lose their loved ones to addiction are affected with a strange sort of survivor's guilt. You know, I've spent most of my life asking myself, what more could I have done? You know, even when my mother was alive, I would think if I was quieter, if I was better in school, if I was funnier, if I distracted her, like what could I do as a child to help this woman with her pain? And much of her pain was loneliness. You know, much of her pain was the isolation that addicts often feel. And so I tried to sort of stem that and cope with that. And then, of course, when she dies, I spent my entire life thinking, what more could I have done, you know? Because the truth is we didn't understand mental health, and I think nowadays we would have had more language and more ways to have helped women like my mother. And by the way, there are so many women like my mother. Even last year, I think over 1,000 people died of alcohol-related deaths in Scotland. And so addiction's not a historical problem, nor is it something that only affects men or people of a lower class. It affects everybody, you know, and there's so much sort of pain there. But writing the novel was a way for me to confront my own grief. There wasn't a catharsis in it. I think people get that wrong if they think I suddenly healed. But what there was a request for understanding. And when you write a fictional world, when you create a fictional world, when you make these characters, you have to sit and contend with their pain and with their motivation. You have to ask why they did what they did. And even if they're doing things you don't like, you have to understand why. And through the questioning of why, just asking why over and over again, I was able to just understand myself and my mother on a much deeper level than I ever had. But funnily enough, I couldn't finish the book until I was in my 40s, because when I was in my 30s, I didn't quite understand the hopelessness that comes in your 40s, not to be too bleak about it. But, you know, I was too optimistic in my 30s, and so I couldn't understand Agnes fully. But as I aged, I started to think, I can understand why someone gives up on a life.
Your second novel, Young Mungo, was published in Danish in 2022. Can you briefly tell us what it is about?
Yeah, I think it adds to the tapestry of Glasgow and of my own life. But it's a story of a 15-year-old boy man called Mungo Hamilton. And he's named after the patron saint of Glasgow, Saint Mungo, because he is a very peaceful, kind soul. But he is growing up in a housing estate in the East End of Glasgow, and he falls in love with another young man called James, who in his spare time takes care of pigeons. He has a large pigeon loft. But it's taboo enough for the time and the place for this working class community that two young men should fall in love. What makes it even more dangerous is that Mungo is a Protestant and James is a Catholic, and so they are crossing sectarian lines. It becomes a very personal issue for Mungo's family because Mungo's eldest brother, Hamish Hamilton, is the leader of the local Protestant gang, and his gang often stages pitched battles with the Catholic gang from the other housing estate. So as Mungo and James fall in love, as Mungo becomes a man, the boys are always under constant threat of being discovered. When they are discovered, Mungo's mother sends Mungo north to the wilderness, the Highlands of Scotland, in order to get him away from the dangers of the city, but also to make him a man, to have him hunt and fish and camp, very masculine pursuits. But she sends him away with two of her acquaintances, and a weekend that should be quite peaceful turns out to test Mungo in ways that no one would ever foresee.
And you are working on a new novel now?
I am.
And what is that about?
I am, yes. I'm close to finishing my third novel, and you know, it sort of completes a triptych. It's not a trilogy, but it's a cycle, if you will. You know, I was very interested in looking with Shuggie. I look at Thatcherism and a young boy growing up gay in Scotland. With Mungo, it's about Majorism, John Major, and a teenage man growing up in Scotland. And this one focuses on adult life under Tony Blair. And so it's set in the late 90s, and it's about a young man who graduates from art school, but he is called home to the family farm in the north of Scotland. And so just as he's getting a sense of himself, he has to return home to take care of an ailing grandmother. But as he sort of packs himself away in order to fit in again with his very devout Protestant father, he brings a lot of secrets home, and he has a lot of unfinished business on the island that he came from.
I'm looking forward to read that. Thank you for talking to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to see you.